This is the color cartoon of a bas-relief proposed for the Battle of Nashville to be placed on the top of Shiloh Hill in Nashville, Tennessee. The Battle of Nashville was the decisive battle of the war between the states and should be remembered by all. On the lower center, a mass of blue surges upward and to the left, with every gun, pistol, and bayonet pointing away. A mass of black troops to the right of the lower center symbolizes the resolve and bravery of black U.S. troops at Peach Orchard Hill. In the center stands Colonel Shaw, for whom the Yankees in admiration named the hill, backed by his bodyguard, Shaw II, surmounted by General Thomas, the victor. Reptile wraiths of white smoke coil amongst the blood-red leaves of battle, searching for the expired breeding of friends and not-so-friends lost. To Colonel Shaw's right and left, a vicious tangle of struggle, hand to hand, groin and throat, knives and bayonet. To his far right, a young giant, Otis Webb, puts a headlock on a blue too close. Directly above is Lieutenant Ryan's wild and noble horse, on whom he made a wild and noble charge, single-handed, on the Yankee line, cut through the line, made a U-turn and cut his way back through the line, and pulled his horse to a raring halt under the nose of General Hood himself, who promptly, all aglow, pulled the medal from off his broad chest and came over toward Lieutenant Ryan, gonna decorate him right there. But young Ryan had other ideas. Just stop right there, General. Just stop right there. You can pin the medal on the horse. If you want to do something for me, get me a new mount. On Colonel Shaw's left, other horsemen have thrown down the gauntlet of personal challenge to knightly combat. May the most fortunate win. But the rule of co-duello, or noble jousting, are not known to a Yankee infantryman at the lower right, who rudely interrupts the fair combat by shooting Colonel Rucker, CSA, in the arm, rendering hors de combat. General Wilson, Northern commander, took Colonel Rucker to his tent and placed him in his own bed. The general sat up all night, writing orders and dispatches, while his Southern prisoner slept. Immediately above Colonel Rucker's white stallion is the bloody saber poised of hate-seethed visage of Colonel McMillan, who rushed upon Colonel Benton Smith, that's General Benton Smith, standing unarmed in a line of prisoners, and slashed him across the head, exposing his brain. General Smith lived until 1923, sometimes in a mental hospital and sometimes not. General Forrest glances fiercely. This is all he could do, for he was not present at the Battle of Nashville. General Hood, in the stupidest move on either side of the entire war, and arguably in all military history, had sent the greatest cavalry leader in the world to Murfreesboro, 30 miles away, to tear up railroad track. Mary Bradford, at the Bradford place on Granny White Pike, runs out to shake her fist at hapless Confederate soldiers whom she considered to be running in the wrong direction. It may be that they were simply seeking a new line of defense behind Judge Lee's stone wall along Battery Lane, but Miss Mary sure wasn't frightened of oncoming Yankees shooting at her. On the far left, General Hood limps on his crutch, and his left arm hangs useless. After the battle, he was seen by his troops weeping uncontrollably. His tears would never cleanse the defeat of its everlasting tears of sorrow that flowed from the hell he played in Tennessee. To his right is Miss Celine Harding, waving a handkerchief to a small troop of Confederate cavalry to encourage them to remember that they fought for all women in the South, in whose hearts they were carried, even as they were carried in hers. Below her is Sister of Charity, coming down from Cincinnati to give aid and wine and water to the wounded and fallen warriors, whether blue or gray warriors. They knew that they were angels of mercy. "Look out, Martha, behind you, oh Lord," cries the body servant to his lifelong companion and friend, Massey. Near him, a sharpshooter tunes his instrument, perhaps for the last time. Above General Hood is General Stephen D. Lee, putting his horse over 2 stone walls on Franklin Pike. "Rally, men, rally, for God's sakes, now is the time for brave men to rally." At first a flag bearer joined him, and then another, and then perhaps 5, or maybe 20 or 100 altogether were enough to hold off the hurtling enemy until Lee's troops on Peach Orchard Hill could form a sturdy rear guard. General Lee saved the Army of Tennessee from complete destruction, if not from disaster and defeat. Colonel Shiloh's servant escaped the northern onslaught and walked and ran 12 miles or so to Del Rio Pike, where the Shiloh home place was. He and Colonel Shiloh's mother returned the next day in a buggy to find Colonel Shiloh. They found him impaled to a tree, naked except for the shred of a flag thrown over him, a bullet hole in his head with a powder burn still around it. Executed. The great historian Stanley says that it was probably done by Colonel McMillan, shown here with a bloody saber. Colonel McMillan was known to have led the charge on Shiloh Hill in front of 1 regiment. He had his previous claim to fame was having been hauled off the field at Bryce's Crossroad in a litter because he was too drunk to walk. Witnesses to this slashing of General Benton Smith knew that a man named McMillan did it, an officer named McMillan. And Stanley Horn, with indefatigable efforts, went through troop list after troop list and located the fact that Colonel McMillan led the charge on the Shiloh Hill, killed Colonel Shiloh, and then probably raced about 100 yards to where General Benton Smith was and sabred him. The barbarities of war are sometimes unbelievably repulsive. Colonel Shiloh, for whom the keystone, the heart, the core of the battle is named, standing here with his bodyguard, was shot and killed, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of blue that assaulted Shiloh Hill. His bodyguard, Shiloh too, immediately left, snuck away, and raced 8 miles or more to Del Rio Pike, where the Shiloh plantation was, and Shiloh's mother. Shiloh too bore the sad news, and the next day returned with Colonel Shiloh's mother to try to find Colonel Shiloh's body. In the gloom of December 17th. This is how Colonel Shiloh was found by his mother and his body servant, Shiloh too, on the morning of the 17th. The body servant had run and walked 12 miles to find his mother, and they came back on the 17th searching for the body of Colonel Shiloh. They found him naked, impaled to a tree, as you see here. This symbolizes poignantly the ironic contrast in the war between the states, between the barbaric as seen here and the chivalric as seen in the duel between Colonel Rucker and Colonel Spaulding, and the treatment that General Wilson gave his enemy, Colonel Rucker, after the battle. The two tendencies of human nature and human culture convened in the war between the states, giving us now, however, the horrors of Holocaust, as witnessed Sherman's march through Georgia, and total war with which we live now in fear. Here on the right, you see a saber duel. Unlikely to have happened in a crowded place, and it didn't. It didn't happen in Shiloh Hill. It happened out on Granny White Pike, about where Old Hickory Boulevard now intersects the Pike. Chalmers had managed to get behind Wilson, the Federal cavalry leader, and of course Wilson had managed to get behind Cheatham, the Confederate leader of the left, on the second day. The Battle of Nashville is, like many Confederate and Federal conflicts during the war, had elements of total war and also elements of chivalric war. And here is a fine example of two gentleman officers fighting according to the Code Duello only. This gentleman here with his pistol, or some stray Federal infantryman, didn't know the rules of Code Duello and shot Colonel Spaulding, the Confederate officer. That's not Spaulding, that's Rucker, Colonel Rucker. Spaulding was the Federal officer, shot Rucker in the arm and disabled him. Now, there was no barbarity following this incident at all. General Wilson took Colonel Rucker to his own tent and put him in his bed, and Colonel Rucker spent a peaceful night in bed while General Wilson, his enemy, sat at his desk writing reports and sending messages to the troops. Afterwards, Spaulding returned Rucker's saber to him, somewhat of a delayed return, 26 years later, but the spirit was correct. And this behavior of the chivalry is always contrasted, of course, by every Civil War battle, that there was always barbarities. I think the barbarity of this gentleman, whom we know or suspect was Colonel McMillan, a Federal officer who we also know was carried off the field of Bryce's Crossroads in a stretcher because he was too drunk to walk. He was in command of a regiment that charged Shiloh Hill, and he senselessly ran on to Benton Smith, standing as a General Benton Smith, standing perfectly stolid and submissive in a line of prisoners, and slashed him across the head with his saber. General Smith lived a long life, but in and out of the insane asylum at Nashville. Here is General Stephen D. Lee, a most excellent Confederate leader. He was in command at Peach Orchard Hill, which was Judge Overton's hill at what is now Franklin Road and Harding Place. Well, Harding Place cuts right through the hill. And at the end of the battle, in the dusk of the second day, General Lee saw that General Stuart's troops were breaking and running across the open ground opposite his forces on Peach Orchard Hill. He put his horse over 2 stone walls, one after another, crossing Franklin Road, and ran to the color bearer whom he spotted and said, "For God's sakes, men, now is the time to rally. Stand." And several heard him. 1 or 2 came, 4 or 5, 10, eventually probably 20 men made a stand. And the startled Federals at this new resistance waited long enough. They held them off, Lee did, long enough that Stuart's troops were able to make it to Franklin Road. And in the meanwhile, of course, Stephen E. Lee's right division fell in behind them and formed an orderly rearguard action. So he saved the Confederate army from complete destruction, because it was a crucial, devastating moment. All right, here is a Confederate soldier, as true as ever was, a black hollering to his master, "Look out, behind you, massa!" And next to him is a Confederate sharpshooter from the mountains, tuning his instrument. There were a great gathering of persons from various walks of life in the Confederate Army. People don't realize that there were a great number of Jews in the Confederate Army. General Lee made a provision that leave should be granted to all soldiers for Sunday observance and also Saturday religious observance in Richmond. And the same situation obtained in the Western Army. General Hood, tragic character. He was found and observed by numerous soldiers. One who wrote a letter home about General Hood sitting by the side of Franklin Pike, weeping as if his heart would break. He knew that he had doomed the Confederacy. His great plan had lost. His great plan was a brilliant and brave plan, in that he felt that he could capture Nashville and proceed to Kentucky and threaten Cincinnati and either invade Ohio or cross the mountains and join Lee and take Washington. Now, with the rich benefit of hindsight, this seems fantastic to us today, but it didn't seem fantastic to President Lincoln or General Grant or Secretary Stewart. They were frantic that Hood should be stopped, absolutely frantic. Reinforcements were sent to Thomas from all over the South and where they could be. Sherman sent troops up to Thomas. Thomas got troops from St. Louis. Schofield came from West Tennessee. And shortly he gathered a great army. The weather played a disastrous trick on General Hood. For about a week or two, the beginning of December, the weather was fine and he would be able to assault Nashville. But the weather turned very icy, impossibly cold. His shivering, ill-clad soldiers were at a disadvantage. It gave Thomas time to build a and train a force, particularly Wilson's cavalry. Thousands of remounts, horses, were equipped and trained to do what they were supposed to do.